Hello, everyone. I am Mykhailo Minakov, and I am the Kennan Institute's Senior Advisor on Ukraine. I am delighted to moderate a short discussion today about our recently published edited volume, From the Ukraine to Ukraine, A Contemporary History. Our book was published at the Ibidem Verlag at Stuttgart and edited by Georgy Kasyanov, Matt Rajansky, and myself. The Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars worked with 20 scholars from Ukraine and the West who contributed to this book, their descriptions and analysis on Ukrainian contemporary history. The book features 9 chapters ranging from Ukrainian society and culture to economics and politics and its recent 30-year history. Since we cannot have all 20 scholars in one video, today we shall discuss just one aspect of the book, Ukrainian society during its 30 years long transition. Today we will feature a conversation with 3 of our contributors who worked on the 2 of the chapters in this book focused on Ukrainian society. We hope to give you a glimpse of what the book is about and a chance to hear from our authors directly about why this book is important for scholars of Ukraine. Let me start by introducing Oksana Mikhaeva and Oksana Shevel, who co-authored a chapter for the book on the development of national identities in Ukraine. Oksana Mikhaeva is a professor at the European University Viadrina. She is also professor of sociology at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv and a member of the International Association for the Humanities and the Ukrainian Sociological Association. Additionally, she serves at the editorial board of Ukraina Moderna journal. Oksana Shevel is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University, current president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, and an associate of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Oksana and Oksana, can you both tell us about your chapter and the big story you try to tell about Ukrainian society during the post-Soviet transition?
Thank you, Mikhail. It's a very big pleasure for me to start this conversation and share our history of co-authoring and writing this paper. This text was written very slowly. Behind each research part, 100 of in-depth interviews. In these interviews, we asked people if they thought about themselves in national or ethnic categories. Most of our interlocutors answered yes. National identity is important to people. Then we detailed the question and asked what it meant to them to be a member of nationality or ethnicity which they named in the interview. This detailing allowed us to see how people construct their national identity, what is important to them and what is not. Our research shows that Ukraine, as well as globally, identity is not fixed and enduring, but situational and malleable, that individuals can have multiple, overlapping and layered identities, and that different dimensions or manifestations of these identities become silent at a given time in a given social political context. In this text, we also turn to the Soviet past, which allow us to gain a deeper understanding of the specifics of those construct of national identities that we have identified in the course of our study. Identities of Ukrainian citizens have been affected by the legacies of the Soviet policies, which forced simultaneous coexistence of an ethnic identity and an all-Soviet one, and decoupled ethnic identity from statehood and citizenship. I think it's very important to understand this difference or this double model of creating identity. It's maybe very briefly my part of big story.
Thank you. And Oksana Shevel.
Yes, I'll just follow up on what Oksana was saying and just add what I think kind of, again, biggest story that our chapter tells. I would echo, first of all, what Oksana already said, that what our chapter really shows how identities are not fixed and enduring, but really situational, malleable, context-specific, constantly constructed and being reconstructed. And I think in that sense, it's also important to keep in mind that Ukraine basically fits within this broader and should be studied with social science tools and concepts that have been developed in identity studies. So it's not some sort of exotic case that cannot be understood by, say, broader specialists, but really I think what our chapter does, that we can relate some of the processes from broader field of identity research to specific Ukrainian conditions. And then I think on the specific Ukrainian conditions, I would add again to what Oksana already said, that I think another kind of big takeaway from our chapter is that Ukraine is really complex. And any sort of this simplistic explanations really miss the point. And I think that has very broad consequences. Say this very typical view of Ukraine is kind of divided between pro-Ukrainian West and pro-Russian East is really too simplistic. And it doesn't really help us to understand what has happened in Ukraine since 1991, starting with the referendum independence itself and subsequent elections and even current conflict. So we can talk more about it in the conversation. But I think this sort of contextualizing, really asking people not just how they identify, but what does it mean for them to identify, say, as Ukrainian or as Russian, or, sometimes people kind of sort of change their identities in the course of qualitative interviews that the chapter aligns on. You can see that. So I think really looking for the story behind the labels, right? And deconstructing these very simplistic labels, I think really goes a long way towards helping to understand broader processes in the Ukrainian society since 91.
Thank you very much. And that's really an interesting, realistic story of what's going on. Not like in mass media when you read, oh, there's another wave of identity building at that or the other moment. And then, thank you very much, Oksana and Oksana. I would like now to bring our other speaker into conversation. Let me introduce Yulia Yurchenko, who co-authored a chapter for the book on class divisions and social inequality in independent Ukraine. Yulia Yurchenko is a senior lecturer in political economy at the Political Economy, Governance, Finance, and Accountability Institute and in the International Business and Economics Department, the University of Greenwich. Yulia, could you please tell about your chapter and this big story that you try to tell about Ukrainian society during the post-Soviet transition?
Thank you very much, Mykhailo. It's been a pleasure being part of this extraordinarily important collection. And sadly, my Ukrainian co-authors cannot be here, but I'm going to try to do justice to this piece that we were working together. One of the many things that we were thinking to look at is specifically kind of how the complexity of the socioeconomic situation in Ukraine plays out. And somewhere else in my work, I look at also how these complex identities that professors who just spoke before me talk about, how they can be exploited for political gain, especially in the conditions of socioeconomic deprivation. And these kind of political categories get created and almost artificially manufactured for political gain. So in this specific piece that's titled Class Divisions and Social Inequality in Independent Ukraine, we try to unpack some of the complex reasons behind Ukraine's mixed post-1991, specifically economic performance. And indeed, there has been many interesting transformations in the country in the last 30 years. And at the same time, in many a manner, Ukraine's performance has been rather abysmal. So by now, it is the poorest country in Europe that is riddled with eye-watering inequalities and littered with often inexplicably excessively rich. So indeed, it is quite a feat and a riddle to get one's head around. How did we get into such a situation? Because on the eve of Ukraine's independence, the country's future looked very promising. There is this oft-cited Deutsche Bank report from 1990s, early 90s, that positioned Ukraine as best fitted, best suited for economic, political, and social growth in the aftermath of the demise of USSR. It was already industrialized, it was economically developed, with well-run public services, an educated population. So the country had every reason to expect a bright future. But instead, Ukraine has seen dramatic rises and falls in GDP. It endured the shocks of the financial crisis that reached it, the ripples of which reached it in 2008 and 9. And it has weathered multiple political and economic crises, really serious shakedowns, specifically known in Ukraine and abroad as Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity. And of course, the most recent crisis that followed the Revolution of Dignity, which in my other work I call the Bloody Winter. So moreover, in this complex situation, Ukraine has been continuously rated amongst the worst post-Soviet states with respect to corruption and violation of democratic and civil freedoms. And on the brink of the protests and bloodshed of 2013 and 14 that put Ukraine on the front pages of the world's newspapers, the country was riddled with poverty, inequality, and injustice. And it was exemplified by the divide between the rich and poor and winners and losers of post-Soviet transition. So what we did in this piece, specifically with my colleagues from Ukraine, they have done a research, they have done a survey on the perceptions of inequality, and specifically looking into the material reality and economic indicators of what is the position of Ukrainian population, how they're broken down in various economic substrata, and at the same time looking at how people perceive themselves. So it's kind of looking into that complexity also that two Oksana professors were just telling us about, because it is not as simple. These kind of simplistic analysis do not quite apply to Ukraine. You have to go with a very fine comb and to try to understand what is going on, how people are seeing themselves, how poverty has come to be, how the process of transformation of post-Soviet Ukraine has created extreme riches, insanely exuberant, complicated financial industrial groups, and a very well-developed network of oligarchy who are also very infamous for keeping key economic sectors to themselves, while also this transformation process has produced masses of impoverished population, a lot of who are seeking a better life abroad, and indeed economic migration has been applied, and we have seen an acceleration of that process, even during the pandemic times, which is also, people are putting their lives at risk to try to seek means for subsistence, which indeed is a very dire state. So we're trying to look at the kind of the causality of this process. How are people seeing this themselves based on the survey? What do macroeconomic indicators tell us? And look at the history of class formations through privatization, dispossession, and accumulation of key enterprises and industries in the hands of the few, and how political power and elite formation process have actually led to the situation where the country is in some sort of weird gridlock where things only get worse, and no matter what reform are being put in place, somehow we're not getting better. So a lot of very complex questions that we try to look into.
Thank you, Yulia. And these days, as we know, the administration of President Zelensky prepares a law that would define the oligarchs. And it's very interesting how politicians and lawyers try to create this definition. If for scholars, it's probably easier in a way to understand what we talk about when we say oligarch or oligarchic network. For the lawyers and politicians, it's something else. So I'm sure that the both chapters on identities and on post-Soviet social divisions will be interesting for our audiences, not only in Ukraine, but outside. But here I have these two questions interlinked, which I want to ask you about. And basically, we are scholars of Ukraine and post-Soviet societies, but why do you think contemporary Ukrainian history is interesting for a foreign audience? And why you think it specifically is interesting for American audience in particular? I would like to ask first Oksana Shevel, who has this direct experience with American audience, and then Yulia Yurchenko, who teaches in UK, and then Oksana, who teaches in Ukraine and in Germany. Oksana Shevel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mykhailo, for this question. Yes, I indeed teach Ukrainian and post-Soviet politics to American students, and oftentimes students come to class not knowing much about Ukraine at all, but interested in, say, like U.S.-Russia relations, right, and sort of how Ukraine fits in that. Like they know that there are conflict there are problems, but how do you even begin to understand this? And I think the research that this book contains kind of on different aspects of Ukrainian society, but specifically about, say, our chapter on identities, I think it does help potential American students and policymakers or general public to better understand some, say, puzzling questions about political developments in Ukraine and foreign policy relations, say, between Russia and Ukraine and the West in particular. Say, like current conflict, right? If you take sort of very stylized view of Ukraine as, again, divided between East and West, or, ethnic Russians having certain identities and certain sets of beliefs, and ethnic Ukrainians having other sets of beliefs, right? Then it becomes really puzzling. Why, for example, say, pro-Russian parties regularly fail to attract much vote in the Ukrainian elections, right? Like parties that sort of market themselves as representing interests of ethnic Russians, right? Or why, say, the so-called Russian Spring, right? This anti-government uprisings after Euromaidan that eventually led to conflict and succession of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, why they were not present all over Eastern Ukraine, where people, again, speak Russian, sort of have maybe positive views of Soviet past, more or less, right? So, and again, so this is only when you can get into these more complex drivers of identity, more kind of complex processes of constructing and reconstructing itself in relations to the state and political development, right, that Ukrainian people are engaged in all the time, as our chapter shows, can you begin to understand why actually, these very kind of simplistic views and expectations don't really make sense, right? So I think for an American audience, again, even though our chapter really gets into kind of fine-grained stories behind individual construction of identity in Ukraine, it really helps to, I think, shed light on these broader questions of interest to the general public, as in, conflict between Russia and Ukraine, potential for this conflict solution, right? Like, what, if anything, say, can US do to alleviate, right, and bring this conflict to conclusion? So I would say this is one of the interests of our chapter to the broader American audience.
Well, thank you very much, Oksana. And Yulia, what is your experience about talking to the British students, British academia, and teaching in this audience on Ukrainian issues?
Thank you, Mykhailo. It's indeed a very important question, and it's good to follow Professor Shevel because he laid such good grounds already to kind of this kind of complexities that are so important. What I find sometimes I don't know, interesting, sometimes difficult to explain to people is precisely this. There is, especially in British academia, I find there is this tendency to think in neat boxes. More than in some other places. I do find that Eastern Europeans do not like neat boxes as much, but that perhaps, is my own sort of biased perception. But I suppose as social scientists, as students of politics, economics, political economy, we are trained to try kind of put things into categories to make sense of very complex things. And it's not that we do not appreciate that things are complex, but we need to get our heads around them somehow. But I think sometimes it's too easy to fall into the trap of thinking that there is nothing but those boxes there. And in our overwhelmingly complex world and being overloaded with information and the streams of it, social media and all the rest of it, it's convenient to go with these categories. But also, in the Ukrainian case, what I found is that when you try to explain to people this complexity, they kind of sometimes don't necessarily even want to listen to it because it's too long to explain. They're like, oh, but they're predominantly this is this, and predominantly, West is pro-Western and East is pro-Eastern. I said, well, you have the same situation, similar situation in Canada and in Belgium, and look at Switzerland, but not everywhere complexity of identities and histories leads to armed conflicts. This is not, something else needs to give. And I think in that respect, actually, I think for me, what I found is that if you make that sort of point of entry and that bring in those analogies, I live in the UK, there is the whole Irish question, there is the Scottish question, there is Wales. So you can, when you start making some of the local analogies and say, well, how do you make these things work so that they don't erupt into conflict? What needs to give? And then you can kind of start showing the relevance of it to other places. And in that respect, what you asked us, how is this story of Ukraine relevant to people in Britain, Germany, US? In US specifically, well, this is actually quite topical, especially in the context of the run-up to the recent presidential election. You remember the escalation and the manipulation and certain sensitivities, especially of people who not necessarily were socioeconomically deprived, but they felt that they were deprived by the system in place. Because when you look at the sociological data of people who were storming the Capitol, they were not necessarily, third generation unemployed living in trailers. They were mostly quite well-to-do people. So it's the perception, and this is why it's so important to talk to people to see where they position themselves socially, whether they see that they're being represented politically, whether they see that their interests are being heard. And we've heard that phrase, you remember, in the east of Ukraine, услышать Donbass, people in Donbass didn't feel like they were heard and represented. The question of political representation and clear message from the government to the people that we are here representing your interest is extremely important. When that connection between people in power and people in everyday life is broken, potential for conflict start opening, and various PR, political technologists, political partisan groups, and especially radical groups can exploit those to fuel conflict and civil ruptures. So places like Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine is actually is a very tragic cautionary tale of where irresponsible politics of manipulation on people's pain, identities, and misfortune can lead. I think there is a lot to learn, and not only about responsible politics, but also for us as scholars about how to treat these complex categories, complex situations, that we always need to go and talk to people and try to understand what is actually going on the ground, and try not to go with ready answers to things, and especially in these kind of dynamically unfolding situations.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, indeed, it's very important, and the academic responsibility is big also on the relations between different groups in Ukraine. But then, what about Germany, Oksana Mikhailova?
Not only about Germany, but about Ukraine too. But it's really a very difficult question of how to be interesting to others. But I try to say briefly and share my ideas. I think that a series of Ukrainian revolutions and the current armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia are prompting people to think seriously about who they are, who we are. It's a question for us. And this is very evident in interview which those people directly affected by events. I mean, internally displaced person, combatants, those who live in the armed conflict zone, etc. Crisis or war mobilize society, contributes to the rallying of some groups and increasing pressure on others. This forces people to reconfigure their identity system and find a way to adapt it to a new context. This redefinition of identity is very important for understanding how people construct their identities. When you have a social agreement about basic things, your identity requires no detailed explanation. On the contrary, the state of crisis, transition, pushes you to think about yourself. And in such situation, people start looking for something that can be an argument in presenting themselves. This is what makes contemporary Ukraine history so important for understanding what identity means in theory. And if you talk about American audience, I think of course, I can talk only about our text, but I think it works on the level of whole book. I think our text, it's a presentation for understanding the peculiarities of identity formation in post-Soviet space. Without an understanding of the influence of the Soviet past, it is quite difficult to understand why there are many difficulties in translating certain terms. For example, when when contemporary Ukrainians use the term Ukrainian, we never know for sure whether they mean political belonging to the state or belonging to an ethnic group. And I hope that our text will help with these losses in translation.
Thank you. That's exactly the case. Well, as you all remember, after each chapter, we also have a list of advised literature to read, to follow. So if our chapter provoked interest in our readership, then you can go and follow some more in-depth research or bigger texts. Well, that or the other way, I'd like to thank our contributors who joined me today for this short discussion. To everyone who is watching this, we have just told you a bit about Ukrainian society and our book From the Ukraine to Ukraine, A Contemporary History. But this discussion was just a tip of the iceberg. You can pick up a copy today through the publisher Ibidem Verlag, from the Columbia University Press website, or on Amazon, which we have links to our website. In our book, you will be able to read not only the chapters from the speakers featured here today, but also read concise and informative analysis of the diverse processes in Ukraine, from the fall of Soviet Union to two Maidans and to the stormy year of 2021. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.